world full of short terms and shorthand terms. Most of these terms are there to make life easier for us. If we want to describe people's personalities, we'll say the person is English, Belgian, Israeli. If we want to describe different people, how different people look, we'll say this person is dark, this person is light. And in Judaism and Yiddishkeit as well, we have different ways of terming people. We have some people say these people are more modern, liberal, secular, or Haredi, Dati-Lumi. And every one of these terms, when we say this, we have some picture that we think about. Someone who really exemplifies this term. When you say the term Baal Tshuva, generally the first picture we come to our mind is someone who is a very, very secular background, who is completely disconnected with anything with Judaism. And then over time, for whatever the reason is, they got excited about Judaism. And then they became a full-fledged, black-hatted, or sheitel-wearing person, an ultimate Haredi. That's how we generally we would explain and understand and picture the concept of a Baal Tshuva. But if we think about it for a second, the word really Baal Tshuva, the word of Tshuva is not exactly that. On the contrary, is the opposite of that. The word Tshuva literally means from the words Teshuva, to return to Hashem. And the concept of returning to Hashem, of becoming closer to Hashem, is every single person on their level. No matter if the person is the most secular, if the person starts making small efforts, even if they don't completely have reached yet, God willing, to become complete Baal Tshuva. But if they're really going to make the efforts to become closer and to change to become closer to Hashem, they're already being called a Baal Tshuva. And as similar, someone is completely religious as well. Though we were brought up religious, we had the film upbringing, but a lot by the religious people as well as also more things that we need to do to return to become closer to Hashem. There was a young man who was one time, he was a teacher in Asia Torah in Yerushalayim, and was passing by the Carlebach in Kabunim, and he was mentioning how in the course of their curriculum, the people, the students are learning tremendous things, and how they make tremendous changes in their lives. And as he's going on, he's coming to realize that he might have given the impression that he's a Baal Tshuva. So he quickly says, he says, Rebbe, but I'm not a Baal Tshuva myself. They're Baal Tshuvas, and I'm not a Baal Tshuva. So Simple Adbunim turns to him and says, and why not? Here tonight, God willing, we'll have the privilege of hearing how every single one of us has been able to make this tshuva. Return to Hashem. And through each and every one's return to Hashem, then our ultimate, our Yom Kippur will ultimately complete. And we truly merit to see Mashiach Tzidkenu. To have to really, truly, the Rebbe is doing that is a person who truly is able to awaken people's hearts. A person who has whose heart speaks pearls. Like the call upon the Rabbah of the Kehillah, the Moshe Lieberman Shlit'a, to give us a few words of how exactly the reflections of the season of Teshuva, Rabbi Moshe.
Shlit'a, Carlebach Shlit'a, and the President, the Governor, and very distinguished audience. I'm not convinced that they have great secrets to reveal about the Indian of Teshuva, or to tell you things that we don't know. Because I think most of us are fully aware of what are the implications of Teshuva. And the question is, of course, what can I add by reflections? Reflections on Teshuva. What's the need for reflections? And year after year we have an occasion to speak Shabbos Teshuva, to speak about Teshuva, and it's not easy to come up with something original, something new. You've heard the story of a rabbi who every year in Shabbos Teshuva repeated the same speech. When people objected to him, Rabbi, why can't you come up with something new? Why always the same speech? And his response was, you may commit the same transgressions every year, and I may not repeat the same speech. In reality, I think the rabbi was wrong, because people don't commit the same transgressions every year. Every year they committed their sins with a new gusto, with a new enthusiasm, with a new enslavement, with a new desire as it was the first time. If he were to deliver his speech with the same enthusiasm as they commit their transgressions, they wouldn't complain. But these speeches grow stale. The Averos, unfortunately, don't grow stale. And the idea is not so much to come up with new ideas, but to deepen that which we know already, to awaken in us a new interest and then perhaps a deeper understanding of what Teshuva is already. We mentioned, I don't think what I'm going to say tonight will be very coherent speech. Some ideas, some reflections. You may ask the question generally, why is there a need for reflections on Teshuva? Who does not know what Teshuva means and what are its implications? Everybody knows what the Rambam says. It begins with regret of what we have done before, a deep commitment to be better in the future, and the confession of sins. These are the three components, or three conditions that are needed for Teshuva, and everybody knows about them. What kind of new reflections can we add so that it's necessary to bring people together and discuss together with Teshuva? There's an interesting thought by the student of the Baal Shem Tov, which explains the minimum size of a shofar, is that when you hold the shofar in the hand, and one side is to project towards the blower, and the other side towards the audience. In other words, if the hand covers the shofar completely, and it does not stick out from both sides, the shofar is not big enough, cannot be used. And he explains the symbolic meaning of this halacha. He says the shofar has first of all point to the blower. In other words, he has to speak not only to the audience, he has to speak to himself. Associate with the people to whom he is speaking. Not consider himself higher than his listeners. As they say, why don't you should castigate your friend, you to approach them. Why double expression? You talk to yourself, you reproach yourself what is missing in you, and if you associate with the others, then you may also reproach the others. But if you think that you're higher than the others, then the terchacha, the castigation, has no value. He said, it has to himself, so it's something that we have to do all together. Let me begin with the question that we have asked, and I think it's in place to mention it here. Rosh Hashanah, the first days of Rosh Hashanah are considered the first 2 days of the 10 days of Teshuva. Aseret Yemei Teshuva begins with the first day of Tishrei and concludes its climax in Yom Kippur. These are the 10 days. And as we have just mentioned, the Rambam mentions that the confession of sins, enumerating the transgressions that we have committed, is an essential condition for Teshuva. There are different opinions among the poskim whether this is really a condition for Teshuva or an additional mitzvah, but it is an important component according to every man. enumerate the sins, and a great deal of the tefillos of Yom Kippur are dedicated to Al-Chay, to enumerate all kinds of transgressions that we may have committed. And nevertheless, even though Rosh Hashanah, the first 2 days, are part of the Teshuva, nevertheless, we are not allowed to mention any transgressions of Hadas during the first days of Rosh Hashanah. In fact, the Tefillah of Avinu Malkeinu begins with the words, "Our Father, our King, Chotonu lefanecha." We have sinned before you, so we say this in a low voice, so in order not to make any confessions on the Rosh Hashanah. And even some minhagim in the Chabad is not to mention it altogether. The question is why? If it is part of the Aseret Teshuva, and if confessing our sins is an integral part of doing Teshuva, how come we are not allowed to do this on Rosh Hashanah? And that's a question we ask Shabbos Shul and Shul as well, those who have heard me already. And we try to explain it with the following story. A story, I think, which has great meaning. The story is of one of the famous disciples of the Choyzer from the Blin, Rav Lieberman, who once came to a city and felt his first obligation. He was going around to collect some money for a very important charitable cause. So he came to one rich man and asked him for money. And it seems that the rich man saw before him a relatively young man. He became very upset by such a young man goes in the man's money for tzedakah, and he began to scream at him, and he did not compose himself until he finally slapped in his face Abdul Lieberman. Abdul Lieberman, of course, didn't say anything and went away. Next day, the rich man, he heard from others whom he slapped. He slapped Abdul Lieberman, who was recognized as a very holy man, a tzaddik, a great righteous man. So he felt very distraught. He didn't know what to do with himself. He was afraid who knows what punishment will come upon him because he has slapped such a great person. So he went to Abdul Lieberman and asked him, so they gave him an advice. Abdul Lieberman is known as a very kind and generous individual. If you were to ask him for forgiveness for what you had done and that you didn't know whom you were slapping, he would surely forgive you, as if it never happened. He went to Abdul Lieberman and asked him forgiveness with tears in his eyes, obviously. So Abdul Lieberman told him, "I can't forgive you, because you didn't intend to slap me. So I can't forgive you, you didn't do anything to me. You slapped a Jew. An unknown Jew. Go to that man whom you slapped. Not me. Me you didn't slap because you never knew who I was. You didn't intend to slap me. Go to him." So he said, "Rabbi, where will I find him? Where is he? If I can't ask you forgiveness, who can I ask forgiveness?" So Abdul Lieberman told him that whenever a Jew comes and asks you for some kind of favor, treat him very kindly and generously. Because perhaps he's the unknown Jew that you have slapped. The idea is he slapped the Jew for no reason at all. He cannot obtain any forgiveness unless all Jews that will come to him, he's going to treat them differently. And in that way eradicate the traces of hatred that he had in himself. I tell this story to indicate that it is impossible to ask forgiveness unless we know first whom we have slapped. If somebody will enumerate his sins, and it becomes an automatic enumeration, he does not realize the seriousness of what he has done, of the transgression that he has committed, then the enumeration has no value. He mentions all the sins and he does not recognize that he slapped the Rabbeinu Shalom by committing these transgressions. The enumeration of the sins are in vain. So that's why we have Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, the basic theme of Rosh Hashanah is, of course, Malchus, with the Shlit'a, We accept, and not only we accept, we internalize in ourselves the idea that the Rebbe Shalom is Melech Kol Haaretz, and he's always in front of us. And if we committed a transgression, we really so-called figuratively slapped the Rebbe Shalom. Once we realize this as a result of Rosh Hashanah, really involving ourselves in the ideas of Rosh Hashanah, then we can begin to enumerate our sins, then begin to realize what we have done, and therefore we can ask forgiveness. Of course, the questions that we would like to ask, and we'll get to that a little later, is what is the idea? Why is confessions of Averos such an important part of the process of Teshuva? The Rebbeinu Shalom, if we don't confess, he knows exactly, without our saying it, what kind of Averos we have committed. We also know what we have committed. What's the idea? Why do we have to confess our sins and verbalizing them in clear terms? Say twice 10 times Yom Kippur. We mentioned the transgressions that we have committed. And again, for what purpose? For ourselves, we know what we have done. The Rebbeinu Shalom also is aware of what we have done. And why is this such an important part of the Teshuva process? That we mention the mitzvah of confessing or vidui. Like the Rambam says, mitzvah is in fact, according to some poskim, the mitzvah of Teshuva is not even mentioned as an explicit commandment in the Torah. According to the Rambam, if a person decides to do Teshuva, then what he has to do is to be his fathers, to confess, to mention, to enumerate his transgressions. And by the way, why is the mitzvah of Teshuva not mentioned in some as a clear-cut command? Because Teshuva has to come from an inner awakening, not because I'm told to do Teshuva. It comes because the person realizes how low he has fallen, what kind of drastic change is needed in his life, and he realizes himself. And this becomes the main motivation for his Teshuva. And this comes only from the person himself, not only from a commandment, external commandment from outside. So that's why Teshuva is not mentioned, according to some poskim, at least clearly as a mitzvah in the Torah. But again, we are back to our question, what does confession accomplish? But I would like to say that the purpose of confessions, and just an idea, is really a double purpose, a twofold reason why we need the confessions, what accomplishes. One of them is, of course, that we recognize. For us, that usually the tendency of people is to try to minimize, even though if we realize that we may have failed in certain ways, in certain manners, we have failed, but nevertheless the natural tendency is to clearly minimize what we have accomplished, to find rationalizations and reasons why we have done this. We all, I think most of us are familiar, and I think it's this important story. The Gemara mentioned this, we should repeat it every year. The famous story of Elazar ben Dodai, which I'm sure many of you have heard already, of a person who was a totally degenerate individual. His whole life he had totally corrupt, until one day something happens and he realizes his total degeneration, and they decided to do Teshuva. He could not come to peace with himself, he didn't know what to do. So I'm going to, Gemara says, he began to plead with the Rebbe Shalom. And his first statement was, Shemayim, if I remember correctly, heavens and sky and stars, Bakshu alai rachman. Plead with the Eternal in order to demand for me compassion. And they told him, we cannot ask for you compassion, it's impossible. Then he said, Horam boys, mountains and hills, bakshu alai rachim, demand from me pity, compassion. And he realizes that this is also in vain, until he finally came to the conclusion, according to the Gemara, Ein hadava tolui elabi. The change depends only on me. And Nosam Moshe ben Birkov, he put his head between his knees, would go up indulgent in crying till he could not utter Yotzel Shmose, until he gave up his soul to the Rabbi Shlit'a. And a voice came from heaven that he, by his total disintegration now, because he felt so deeply the depth of his degradation, and because it totally penetrated his whole being to the point that he could not live anymore, he acquired Olam Haba, a world in a share in the world to come, even though his whole life was a life of transgression and without any limit, without any redeeming value. Nevertheless, because of the last minute of his life, he was totally so lost in this world that he could not find a place for himself, and he was a Mezumah L'Chayolim Haba. The Gemara says further, when the Rebbe heard this, Rabbeinu HaKodesh, he was the prince, the leader of the Jewish people in his time, he said, Yesh Koina Rebbe, he cried. Rebbe cried, right? Yesh Koina Elome B'Sha'achas. It's possible for somebody to acquire his word to come in 1 minute. And therefore he cried. So I would like to say a few words about this Gemara. First of all, what is the meaning, according to some commentators, that the heavens or the stars or the hills or the mountains should plead for him. And then ultimately he realized that first he mounted the stars to intervene and try to help him, or the mountains to try to help him. What is the figurative meaning of that expression? So we explained it in the following manner. It's not based on my own interpretation. There are other commentators who explain it that way. We all remember, and there's an interesting message, we all remember, there was in Cain committed the first murder in the world. The Rebbeinu, the Eternal, turned to him, Hey Hevel, where is your brother Hevel? And his response was, Hashomer Ochi Anochi, am I the guardian of my brother? And the Eternal said, the voice of the blood of your brother cries to me from the earth. So the question is, who was Cain playing games with? He was the son of Rabbi Moshe. And he thought that the Rebbeinu does not know what happened to Hevel. What is behind these words, Hashem am I the guardian of my brother? And he didn't know that God knows that he killed his brother. What kind of response is this? What kind of game is he playing with the Eternal? There's a very interesting midrash on this. He said that there's a deeper meaning to these words. Yes, Cain maintained, like so many modern people maintain today, I'm not responsible for my bad behavior. There are forces that drive me. My upbringing, the surrounding, the television, the society, the total atmosphere in the world has corrupted me. There's nothing I can do about it. He said, do I have to guard my brother? You have created the world. Had you not failed to accept my sacrifice, I would never have killed my brother, because he killed him out of an expression of a spirit of jealousy, because God accepted the sacrifice of heaven and not his. And the message goes on. Am I responsible? You have created in me a tendency for evil. You have created me that way. Why do you blame me? It's your world. You have created them. And Ben Shalom told them it was your action, because the blood of your brother Christ. And it was your decision, your free will that I have implanted in you that has decided to kill him. And in the same way we understand what was the complaint of, what was the taina of Rosenberg the Dyer. He says, it's not my fault. The stars in heaven, that's the way I was created. That was my nature. That's how I was formed. There's nothing I could do about it. Until they realized that this is a very poor rationalization. Because ultimately it was his decision to give into his natural tendency. It is his decision. There is a free will a person can give a decision. Harm and wise means the ups and downs in the world, the events of the world have caused me to become that way, the society, the surrounding, whatever happened to me, until finally I realized that this is also a very inadequate explanation. Until he says, I'm responsible. Once he realized that the full responsibility is upon his own shoulders, of course, he could not accept his life, and therefore he did Teshuva with all his being, and the Teshuva was accepted. And that is why I thought the explanation, Noshan Moshe ben Birkov. What's the symbolic meaning? He put his head between his knees. Because the head should have guided him in his life, to be able to see the consequences of his action, to think through what he does. But the head played no role in his life. Noshan Moshe ben Birkov, we abolished it completely. And as a result of that, God the fear could not accept him. So the idea of originally he wanted to try to blame outside circumstances for his demeanor, and of course finally he realized the truth that however valid the outside circumstances may be in our lives, ultimately, as long as we have a rational mind, we have what is the God-given power of free choice, and the decision is ours. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have to enumerate our sins. And I give two reasons. I've said it's twofold. One reason is because in order to recognize the dimensions of our transgressions. Otherwise we look for rationalizations, and there are so many rationalizations and superficial explanations for our behavior, instead of recognizing our own weakness or our own failure to give in to what is driving us. And we have the ability to overcome that. But no, that's why we enumerate our sins, so mention them clearly, so in order to avoid that minimization of our responsibility, so that we recognize clearly to what extent we are responsible. That's one reason why we confess and recognize what we have done. Otherwise we try to weaken our responsibility and to reduce our guilt. And that's the natural tendency of people. Even if they recognize they're committing an error, they want to reduce it. That's one reason why we should clearly define for our eyes what we have done. And to remove that possibility of minimizing our guilt. But there's also another reason. I've seen an explanation, the Torah said, the written deposit, Yazor V'Rosha Darko, that the evil person should abandon his ways. So one Rabbi, I don't remember who interpreted, Yazor V'Rosha, that the evil person abandoned the idea that Darko, that this must be his way, that he cannot act otherwise. That he's determined that there's no way for him to get out and change his demeanor. Because people think, darker, that's my way and I can't change, and that's how I've been created. Yazor Moshe should abandon this idea that he is already lost, he's committed completely to his evil ways, and it's impossible to change. There's another reason. One reason we said is to avoid minimization of his responsibility. The other reason is, how should I say, the Gemara says, if one has a deep concern, a deep worry, one of the solutions is to speak it out, to clarify it, to put it in perspective. Because as long as he does, that's one of the methods of the psychiatrist. If somebody has some secret problems that he has secret traumas, and one of the ways of trying to help them is to speak them out. Otherwise, they're part of your life, they're an integral part of your being, they become part of your subconscious and cannot be free yourself from it. Once you speak it out, you put it in perspective. And the fact that you mention it verbally and clarify it, you only externalize to a degree your own deeper inner worries, and becomes a separate life, a separate entity, and therefore you can begin to deal with it. And until you're able to speak it out and define it and describe it clearly what has happened, it has become part of your life and gives you no rest. One of the ways the Aga B'Lev if you have a deep worry, a deep concern, and you don't know how to free yourself from it, one is Yasachena Medata, another is Yasachena Lachim. Tell them to others. Clarifying as a result of that, it becomes externalized from your own being, and therefore it's easier to handle with it. So the idea of confession avera is twofold. One of them is, of course, to recognize the degree of the guilt. The other one is not to exaggerate it. It's not part of you. It's something that's outside you. And once you recognize, you enumerate the sins, you put them outside of your being. And therefore you can ask for forgiveness, recognize that you have done it, but it's not really part of you. And this is an important recognition of our process of Teshuva. Yazoiv Losha Darko. The evil man should abandon the idea that this is basically his death and he cannot change. We all can change, but we have to awaken to create the will within ourselves. There's a little charming story which I already have told to a number of people, but I think it serves a purpose to somehow illustrate what I'm trying to say. I have a daughter in Swas, and she has a big mishpacha, and she had one little boy. Now he's married with 4 or 5 kids and a very superior individual in many ways, spiritually, and accomplishes a great deal. But when he was a little boy of 3 or 4 years, he was impossible to handle. Very bright and very rambunctious. You could not handle him. So his mother once told him, "Son, you're so strong that you can overcome your Yetzer Hara. You can overcome your evil inclination." And he answered, "I'm so strong, I can even overcome my Yetzer Tov, my good inclination." And the mother told him on the spot a word that made him cry. You can't do that. Because the Yetzer Tov, that is you. And you cannot be strong and very well. The Yetzer Hara that comes from the outside. And that is a very important concept in our lives. And that's why we confess our sins. To recognize that's a confession, it's there, but it's not we. What we is the Yetzer Tov. And once we recognize this, it's easier, much easier to handle them. Because we know that we don't eradicate part of ourselves, we eradicate that which has grown as an outside in ourselves, external. And therefore, that's one of the important purposes. That we have confessing the sins is facing them with all the courage that we can in both ways, not to exaggerate them and not to minimize them. Not to exaggerate them that we are in their hands, the day Avera, in the hands of Avera, that we cannot escape from them. That is not true. On the other hand, is not to minimize them, and that's the double purpose, it seems to me, for why it is so essential that when we do Teshuva, that this becomes an important component of the process of Teshuva, is to confess our sins. I would like to continue, how much time I have left, a little bit more time. I would like to continue, since we are on the session of Teshuva, and we are getting ready for Yom Kippur. I would like to give one dimension. What is the distinction and the uniqueness of this day of Yom Kippur? What does it really represent? For some people, it's a day like any other day. Nevertheless, it's a special day. It's so special that we find in the Gemara a very interesting discussion. A discussion between the Rabbeinu HaKodesh, the one who was the organizers of the Mishnayos, the publisher of the Mishnayos, the leader of Klal Yisrael and the Chachamim. What does what is the argument? What does it consist of? Difference of opinion. Rabbeinu HaKodesh says, it's a shocking statement, but we should think about it. Rabbeinu HaKodesh says that in Kippur, it's Sumoy Shel Yoim Mechaper. The essence of this day is helping, is wiping away our transgressions. Whether you do tshuva or you don't do tshuva, proper tshuva, the essence of the day brings about an atonement. The Chachamim say no. They say you do tshuva, then, and that's the halacha, only if you do tshuva you change your ways, you recognize the degree of your guilt, and then you do tshuva, you accept that for the future your behavior will be different, and there's the inner transformation of your attitude, then Yom Kippur is mechaper. But Rabbeinu HaKodesh, he says, no, the day itself has some mysterious quality that brings about the atonement of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people, even if they don't do the proper tshuva or they don't do tshuva. I don't want to go into details, but it's an astonishing statement. And the Farshim say that even the Chachamim, who say that you have to do tshuva, also agree that what brings about the atonement is the day. But there's a condition. Rabbeinu HaKodesh, there's no need for that condition of doing tshuva. The day itself is so overwhelming, so powerful, so important, that it will wipe away your aveilus even if you don't do tshuva. And Chachamim say no, you have to do tshuva, but it's still the force, the mysterious force of that day that brings about the atonement in Klal Yisrael. And these are clear-cut statements in the Gemara, and I think it requires some explanation. I don't know whether I fully understand it, or that we can fully understand it. This is with the mysterious part of Torah. But nevertheless, a little bit, we have to try to approach it, try to bring it a little bit closer to our understanding. Now, I would like to explain it in the following manner. The Gemara says, Gedolei Teshuva, that Teshuva was Gedolei Teshuva she'mevia refuah la'olam. Teshuva is great because it brings healing to the world. And there's also another statement, Teshuva kodma la'olam. The concept of Teshuva, of being able to change one's ways and return to its origin, to the relation, to the source, preceded the existence of the world. And of course, that's a strange statement on the surface. Before the world existed, there were no people. Who needs a tshuva? For who will need the concept of tshuva? Tshuva is needed only if one is committed in Avera. And there's no other way, and the Rebbeinu will forgive him for transgressions if he does tshuva. But the Kodma Leila, before the world was created, is there a need for tshuva for whom? Who is the Malachim don't have to do tshuva? And even the Malachim are part of the creation of the world. And tshuva preceded all that. What's the idea? Very briefly, I think I would like to explain as follows, if I may. I hope I'll succeed. Tshuva, you know, there's a Kabbalistic, Kabbalah interpretation. What is the word olam? According to Hasidus and Kabbalah, the word olam is etymologically derived from the word helam. Helam means nelam, concealed, hidden. It's not visible. Now the whole idea of the creation of the world is that the source of creation is concealed and not visible. That's why the Torah begins, Bereshit bara Elokim, not the Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei is not mentioned at the beginning. Bereshit bara Elokim. Elokim is in the world as he is concealed. It does not reveal who he is. The whole idea of the world as we see it is that the world is, we don't see the creative force in the world. We see a physical world in front of our eyes. And I don't have to tell you that scientists who believe only in what is standing before our eyes don't think of anything beyond the screen, beyond that which they see. Nothing else exists. Because the Rebbe Shomre has created the world Elam. Elam is heaven. He has hidden the real source of existence. That's how the Rebbe has made the world. Bereshit bara Elokim, it's hidden. The world is time, the world is space, and there are three dimensions according to the Swarm in the world. There's time, space, and there's also the soul which has been created in the world. But that's why we have to say, every day we say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And we say it twice, and we cover our eyes. Because what we see with our eyes does not show us the inner unity, the inner unifying force, which is the godly force that creates the world. We see a multiplication of phenomena around us. We close our eyes to recognize that this is not the real reality. That is how the Rebbe Shomre has created it. But behind that and beyond that is a totally different reality. And which is not limited by time and not limited by space. It's only because the Rebbe Shomre has created the world. Olam means forever, means space, time and Olam means the world, the space and time. And that is the whole world is space and time. When we live in space and time, we are limited by space and time. And therefore, if we commit a sin, there's nothing we can do. There's no time machine that will bring us back and eradicate and abolish what we have accomplished, what we have done has done. We cannot bring back time, we cannot go back in space. This is permanently fixed and there's no change there. It's permanent, no change. That's the world. The Rebbe Shomre has created that limited world. The Rebbe Shomre has also at the same time given us an opportunity, a light that sometimes breaks through these barriers and shows us something beyond the existence of the world. All miracles are that way, the expression of godly power that breaks the laws of the world. But that's every miracle, every rare miracle that happens. But normally, we don't see that miracle. Normally, we see only the world. And according to these laws, according to these restrictions, the whole concept of Teshuva is irrational, cannot be accepted. What has been done has been done. Now there's a story of about the famous Radomski Rebbe, the Tefer Shlomo. He had one chassid who was formerly a very famous physician, and he influenced him. He became a Baal Teshuva, not ordinary Baal Teshuva. He became himself almost a Rebbe, a very saintly man and tzaddik. And when he was already an old man, the Radomski Rebbe, the first Radomski Rebbe, the Tefer Shlomo, was the talent of the Choizer, went to visit him. And the doctor, I don't remember what was his name, was a famous doctor, he was the Baal Teshuva, the tzaddik, was somehow sighing. I don't know why, pain or what. And the Tefer Shlomo thought that he was sighing because he reminded himself of his former life, which was full of transgressions. And the Rebbe, in order to comfort him, told him, Hayomim Havushonim Yiplu. The first day will disappear. The first days, the old days where you were not what you were supposed to be, will completely disappear. And the tzaddik responded, I'm not renouncing on a single one of those days. What did he mean by that? Days were full of transgressions. Because the Gemara says that if one does Teshuva with his me'ava because of total, overwhelming love for the Rebbe Shomre, and this again is shocking statement that requires clarification. If one does Teshuva me'ava, shav me'ava, Zedonos, I'll read it, I'll say it, is not as like a Shlit'a. Those transgressions that he committed willingly, intentionally, which is the worst kind of transgression, become transformed into positive mitzvahs, zechiyas, into positive deeds. How does a avera, open transgression, become suddenly a mitzvah for which he's going to receive a reward? And probably that's what the doctor meant when he said, I don't renounce on any of these single days because they had given me the impetus, because I felt how low I had fallen. This has given me the impetus to change my life. And they have become changed from a negative force, they've become transformed into a very positive force, which helped me change completely. Now this is not something that comes from this world. Because this is something that preceded the existence of the world. The Rebbe is called Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. And Chacham say, what is the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the ineffable name that we are tetragrammatic, which we are not allowed to pronounce? Hoya Hoiver Yeh Ke'echa. For us, what was, what is, and what will be are three dimensions. You can't confuse them. What was is passé. What is now we feel at the moment. What will be, you can't confuse them. Now I've explained it, Shabbos, imagine somebody, a sculptor who plays with clay, and he makes all kinds of forms. A piece of clay he makes into a head, another piece of clay he changes into a leg, and then he puts it in the oven, and he bakes it, it becomes hardened, and becomes permanent, and there's nothing can change. What is made into a head is a head, what is a toe is remains that way, not going to change. Imagine if there was a possibility to bring back that figure to its former state when it was still malleable, when it was still very soft, it could change it. And what is now a head could be changed because at that time it had no form. Everything was included in the piece of clay, potentially it could be whatever it was. Now for us this is impossible. We live within the dimension of time and space, we cannot change anything. But Teshuva is a godly influence, a godly ray that is before the creation of the world, when all was one piece, the past and the future and the present are all one. And this shines through that barrier. And Teshuva is wonderful force that the Lieberman gave to us in order to be able to go back to where it was before. This is not irrationally, we don't know how it happens, but that's why they say it's a special gift from before the creation of the world that we have that possibility. To go beyond ourselves, to surpass ourselves, to surpass time and space, to surpass the creation, to connect with the Lieberman himself, which is beyond creation. That is the Gedolah Teshuva. Teshuva is great Shemagas. It reaches up to where? At Kisei HaKavod, to the throne of glory. Above the limitation of the world. But part of our life, of Jewish life, is to recognize that the world we live in is limited, is Helen. It's not the real reality. Of course, we live in it. The Moshe was created on that way. But he gave in our Shomre, in our being, that ability to be able to say, the image of God, saying the portion is free will. Some of us will say, what's the image of God that is within man, which the creating force? It's the free will. There are drives. All other creations are driven by other forces. They're not the bosses themselves. No animal can sit and deliberate, I want to do this, I want to do that, and I decide to do that against my inner will, because I have free will. And that's the Tzelem Elokim that and we mentioned three dimensions. There's the dimension of the soul, there's the dimension of time, there's the dimension of space. The dimension of the soul is the free will which breaks through the hell in the nefesh. The dimension of Teshuva breaks through, the idea of Teshuva breaks through the limiting dimension of time and space. And in that way, Yom Kippur is that unique, that's why it's even beyond what we do. Beyond our accomplishment, it comes from the Lieberman himself which makes the inner connection between our existence, between our world, and the ultimate true reality. Not the uniqueness of Klal Yisrael, but to have that connection which goes beyond the existence of the world. And in that sense, Yom Kippur is a special day. Just as going in space, we have the Kodesh HaKodeshim, going into the Heichel where there was, don't have time to go into that now, in that mixture of physical world and beyond the physical world, which was a reality. I don't know what time do we have now? When you go beyond the reality of time and space in the Beis HaMikdash, because there was the Olam Eino Min HaMideh, there was an element of miraculous existence in the Kodesh. There is the neshama of the individual, the Tzelem Elokim, and there is also in time the Yom Kippur, which is the revelation of the Beishon himself, and therefore there's a possibility that that influence of the Beishon wipes away everything, removes everything, and brings us close to the Beishon. Now, there is I heard recently of someone, a Jewish person, who gave his whole life to the idea of a sport. I don't know exactly what athletic ability he was engaged in. But you know that those who do sport, they do it with their whole life, and everything else is sacrifice for being successful in the sport that they engage in. All day and night, all ounce of energy is devoted to that goal, be excellence in it. So one day, was Yom Kippur, he had to go do some kind of competition, and for some reason or other he decided he's going to give it up, that rare opportunity to participate in that performance, because it's Yom Kippur. He was not religious, but somehow Yom Kippur spoke to him. After Yom Kippur, he thought, what's happening to me? Am I crazy? My whole life I have given away to sport. I had an excellent opportunity to show my skills, and because I was there in Yom Kippur, I gave it up. What's happening to me? Why did I do that? He began to investigate what was bothering him, and little by little he began to realize what Yom Kippur is. And somehow, I don't know the name of the person, but it seems to be a true story. Eventually, he changed his whole life, and his sports was not his ultimate idol in his existence. He became a religious Jew, and he had other goals in life simply than to be performed in an excellent way in sport. Which means that there is something in us that is, we say, break through the barriers of time and space, and really somehow works within our own being and has some kind of influence on it. We have to know how to utilize it. There is a spark, but we have to know how to utilize that spark. And what covers it, I think I told the story this last Shabbos Shuvah. When I was in Chicago years ago, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe used to send every year some kind of one of his important Hasidim to come to Chicago to visit the people, to get some money for his causes, and at the same time also to strengthen their connection with Hasidus and Judaism. So there was a local Rav who was not a Chassid, but he took him to one of the rich people in town and presented his case to him. The name of the Rav I remember was Rav Perlstein. When he went to the rich person asked his Chassid who came from New York at that time, and then it was a 15-hour ride before he could take a plane. And he asked him, what are you coming here to Chicago for? So the Rav answered for him, you know, there are Sifrei Torah that are written in black letters. Sometimes the letters become faded, the ink falls off, and we need a scribe who comes and refreshes the letters, gives them a new shine, he writes over the letters. And this is the task, the mission of this man who came from New York. We Jews are far away from New York. At that time, Chicago was a different world. And the shine of our letters becomes faded, becomes weakened, a little bit is erased. We need someone to come and refresh them. And okay, so the Shlit'a Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he was very impressed with this very beautiful illustration. And he told the Rebbe what the Rav said, and that the mission of the Shliach is to refresh the letters in the Sefer Torah. So the Rebbe told him it's a very good idea, but it is not true. Because the way a Jew is connected to the Torah is not by letters that are written, but by letters that are engraved in stone, which cannot fade, which cannot be removed. They can be filled up with dust and sand and dirt, so that they're not recognized anymore. That's very possible. It happens very often. But all you have to do, but they're still there. They did not fade. They're just covered up by the dust that accumulates as a result of our struggles in life. And if you clean them up, the letters become shiny with new force. The idea is that there is within us engraved in those letters, regardless of how much dirt they may have been covered up. And this is illustrated by, this will end by these two stories in the Medrash. Medrash tells the following story. It is written in Parshas Vayishlach that when Yaakov went into Yitzchak to obtain the brachos, you remember he was dressed in the clothes of Esau. And he looked like Esau when he requested the brachos. And by the way, sometimes in our life, we have to put on the clothes of Esau. We have to do business. We have to deal with all kinds of people. We cannot, all of us, live a pure life from beginning to the end. But all we do is only to be clothes. It's not part of our being. It's clothes that eventually can be removed. It's only, that's why the question is, how come Yaakov received the brachas by treachery, not by being what he really was? Sometimes you receive the brachas in this world by acting as if the world was important, and in reality we know that that is not our main purpose in life. We engage in business to deal with all kinds of people, but we at the same time know that this is only a beggar. This is not our real mission in our existence. There's a higher mission. Anyway, the Medrash says, "Vayarach es reach begodav." Yitzchak felt the fragrance of his clothes, and and he blessed Yaakov. So it's a very interesting Medrash. The Medrash says, don't read begodav and boigdav. What does boigdav mean? Traitors. He felt the fragrance of his traitors, and as a result he gave him a blessing. Strange Medrash, isn't it? If Yitzchak felt the fragrance of the traitors of Klal Yisrael, and as a result of that he gave him a blessing. What is the way? The Medrash goes further. What do I mean by that? He says that at the time when the Hellenists were holding sway over the people of Israel in Eretz Yisrael, it was mentioned in Pirkei Avos a great sage, Yosef ben Yezer, in Yerushalayim. At his time, it was his nephew, who was a traitor to the Jewish people. He was a committed Hellenist, who did everything possible in order to eradicate Judaism from the Jewish people and imitate the Greek culture and their all their worst degradations. And one day, so he was the one, and one Shabbos, he led his venerable uncle to be hanged on the gallows. The uncle was Yosef ben Yezer. His name of that traitor was Yaakov Ish Sereida, and he led his uncle to be hanged on the gallows, tells the Medrash. On the way, he was not happy simply to lead his uncle to the gallows to be hanged, but he taunted him and told him, look at what kind of horse you're going to be riding, meaning you're going to hang there, and I sit on such a beautiful horse to lead you to the gallows. So the uncle told him, he says, if even you, who go against the will of the Rebbe, transgress the godly will, have such a great reward. Imagine those who fulfill his will, what kind of reward and what kind of pleasure awaits them eventually. He said, what are you talking about? Is there anyone who fulfilled the will of God more than you? See what kind of tragic end awaits you when you tell me stories. So he said, if even those who fulfill the will of God are destined for such a tragic end, imagine what kind of bitter end awaits those who transgress the will of God. Imagine what awaits them. And then the Medrash says, those words of Yosef and Eliezer went into the heart like a poison, worked on him, on this traitor, worked so hard on him that he could not find any rest. He brought upon himself all kinds of punishment. And on that same day he passed away, and Yosef and Eliezer said before he died that he preceded me in Gan Eden. That's one story. The Medrash goes on over there, same spot, with another story. The other story was one day when the Greek, about the same period before that, surrounded the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, before the miracle of the Hashanah of Hanukkah. And they said, we want to profane, to defile the Beis Hamikdash, the holy temple, but it should be one of theirs, of the Jews themselves should do it. We don't want to do it. Wanted them to do it. And the general who was there decreed that whoever goes into the temple, whatever he takes out will be his as the reward for his defiling the Beis Hamikdash. So one Jew everybody of course remained motionless, but one of them walked in and carried out a golden Carlebach, a golden menorah from the Beis Hamikdash. So the general said, that's too much for you. If you go in another town, whatever you take out now will be yours. And he said, no, I'm not going anymore. It's enough, Yichasti es boiri. I angered God once, second time I'm not doing it. According to the Medrash, they tortured him in the most possible manner. And he cried, Oili shechasti es boiri. Woe to me, I angered my Creator. He didn't cry out of pain. He cried me out because he angered the Beis. And these are the boidim, that because of such traitors, who eventually did Teshuva, that Yaakov received the blessings. The question is, we should ask ourselves, what happened there? What made Yaakov, that traitor, what made him change his mind? There was nothing in the world around him that has changed. He still sat on the horse. He was still the leader. The big tzaddik Yosef and Eliezer was being led to the gallows. But just a few words of Yosef and Eliezer were so powerful that they penetrated into his very being like a poison and brought about this total transformation. What happened there? So I thought the explanation is follows. That this Yaakov was not an ordinary killer. Remember, communists had an idea, and because of the idea, they destroyed thousands of lives, hundreds and thousands of lives. They thought they were right. They thought the misconstrued ideal. They thought they had an ideal for which they were working. He also thought an ideal. He thought the progress is with the Hellenists, and if there are some Jews old-fashioned to still cling to the Torah, we have to eradicate them. And he thought he was moved by a very important idea. And suddenly he saw in this old uncle of his a totally different way of looking at the world. The facts did not have any impression upon him. It was a total way of looking at a different perspective on what is happening. So he realized, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe because of a wrong idea I killed, I plundered, and I destroyed Yiddishkeit because of a wrong impression, of a wrong perspective that they had. Therefore, I could find no rest. Which means intellectually he was corrupt, a wrong idea intellectually that destroyed his whole life, and suddenly that veil was removed and he saw a different reality before him and he could find no rest. That was Yaakov. The second one was not moved by any intellectual considerations. He was moved by pure greed. How low could a person fall that he should be the first one to go to the Beis HaMikdash to fight it because he's one soul? And even a person has fallen so low, as we said before, so much dirt and dust has accumulated upon his soul that he has fallen so low, goes to fight the Beis HaMikdash. Deeper than that, there was still that was a great in his spirit. That the attachment, even though it was not visible, it was visible something else. So the first one was covered by false ideas, intellectually wrong, intellectually deformed. The second one was by his tiger, by his lust, by his greed. Nevertheless, underneath all that, there was still a spark that could be awakened. And it was awakened, and they eventually became tzaddikim that gave their lives. So this is the meaning what the Medrash says, V'yorach es reach b'godov. And the Medrash says, not b'godov, but b'godov. A little strange. How come the Medrash say the word b'godov, which means clothes, and he changed it to mean traitors? No, there's a deeper meaning in that. It comes to teach us that even b'godov, even the traitors, it's only a baguette. It's only an outside clothes, outside vestment that he has. And underneath, there's still something that lives for the Beis Shalom. In every Jew, regardless what clothes he has, and that's why the Kerach of Teshuva is to awaken that spark which rests within every one of us. But it's not enough to awaken it, we have to make it a powerful influence in our life, to bring actual changes, and to do Teshuva, connect with the world, what is beyond the world, the Rabbi Moshe himself, through Teshuva to the day of Yom Kippur, and that way we merit, yes, Hashem, the great grace of the Rabbi Moshe, of Shomre, of Mesukah, of a happy and healthy year for us, for all of Israel, and we say to the good Shlit'a, and we have a